The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend. This quote by Robertson Davies from his 1951 novel Tempest Tossed helps to explain why people have bias and favoritism. A great TED Talk speech by Chimamanda Adichie that I have studied and analyzed also does a great job of reasoning why these kinds of bias and prejudice can happen. This is important to talk about because our generation can change the world if we all acknowledge and learn from our biases. Today I'm going to tell you first who Chimamanda Adichie is, second, give you an excerpt from one of her famous speeches, and third, tell you about how it has affected me. To begin, Chimamanda's website, last updated in August 2017, hosted by the University of Liège, tells us Chimamanda was born in Nigeria in 1977, has written 3 books, and received numerous awards, including the 2008 MacArthur Foundation Fellowship Award. In Chimamanda's speech, she explains that she grew up on a university campus in Nigeria because her father was a professor and her mother was an administrator. She became an early reader at age 4 and an early writer at about the age of 7. Chimamanda gave this speech through TED Global in July 2009. Now that you have an idea of who Chimamanda is, I'm going to read an excerpt from the beginning of her speech, starting at about 35 seconds. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of things I was reading about. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, they ate apples, and they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside of Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, especially as children. I think because all I read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to be about foreigners, and about things that I could not personally identify. Now I'm going to read an excerpt from the middle of her speech at around 7 minutes and 30 seconds. I had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. They drove cars, they were not starving, therefore they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty in the question of a single story. A few years ago I visited Mexico from the U.S. The political climate in the U.S. at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration, and as often happens in America, immigration is synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, these kinds of things. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling the tortillas at the market, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind and one thing only: the abject immigrant. I had bought into this single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. Now that you have heard a little bit about Chimamanda's speech, I'd like to tell you how this speech has personally affected me. As a middle-class white American, I have learned and seen things in a specific way. In my wonderful hometown of Colorado Springs, there is not a lot of diversity. It was easy to fall into the danger of learning one side of the story and a side I knew well. Like many people Chimamanda spoke about in her speech, I have also found myself making these kinds of assumptions. looking at the stereotypes and the way other countries and cultures have been portrayed to me. I found myself seeing the news and other media outlets showing me negative and untrue representations of people. As Chimamanda says, so that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. When one person or one story is presented over and over again, people begin to associate that one thing to a whole group of people. In our society, it is easy and almost natural to categorize people. It helps us create connections between them. These categories can be dangerous when developing opinions. If we as a generation can teach our children about other cultures more authentically, we can advocate for open-mindedness in a whole new way. In conclusion, today I have shared with you first who Chimamanda is, second, one of her famous speeches, and third, how this speech has affected me and how it can affect the world. It is our responsibility to create a change in our society. I would like to end with the same quote Chimamanda ended her speech with, that when we reject the single story, when we realize there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.